It's a time of year where managing annual Lespedeza is critical. 20 years ago, everybody was planting annual Lespedeza. There were more cultivars on the market. I haven't heard as much about it, and it's possible that it was grazed out, not all the way out. You have some remnant plants. But for those who are thinking about annual Lespedeza in the future or have annual Lespedeza now, these next 5 or 6 weeks are critical to the management because it's an annual. We'll talk about that. Here are the topics. We'll talk about what is annual Lespedeza. It's good to clarify this. Why grow annual Lespedeza? And we'll talk about managing, and might as well go ahead and talk about establishing because people will be frost seeding in 4 or 5 months, and then we'll have some conclusions. It's important when we talk about annual Lespedeza to not confuse it with Serratia Lespedeza. Serratia is a perennial. It's a super high tannin forage. I guess you would say forage for some producers, especially if they have sheep or goats. But in general, Serratia Lespedeza is thought of as nothing more than a noxious weed and an increaser and an invasive plant. We're not talking about Serratia, even though it says Lespedeza. We're really talking about annual Lespedeza, which is an annual legume that in Missouri grows in June, July, and August through September as well. It's important in Missouri, or interesting anyway, to consider annual Lespedeza in terms of the history. We have a connection with some of the great Lespedeza breeders, and the first one to talk about in our state is Sam Offutt. And Sam was a World War II veteran. He was on a bomber crew, B-17, who operated in the European theater. After the war, he returned to his home in Mexico and then enrolled at Mizzou. And you can see down here at the bottom, there are 15 graduates from Audrain County listed. This would be 1948. And one is Sam Offutt. Notice his first name, Marion. That'll come into play later. And Sam got his PhD and became a professor and retired at the University of Arkansas. There's still a Sam Offutt scholarship there. By the way, Lyle Thompson also was World War II, as was Don Brown and Art Spooner. Many of these professors were excellent professors, had served in the war, came home, got their degrees and PhDs, and became forage, crop, and soils professors, and Sam was one of them. In 1963, he released Summit Lespedeza. Summit is a Korean type. We'll talk about that in a minute. And we still have Summit available, not in the stores here, but it is available through some breeding stations. He also released, or was close to releasing, a Kobe type. So Summit here is Korean type. We'll talk about that. And then what would become Marion Lespedeza was a Kobe type. And he had this genetic line. He could never finish it. And so in the late 80s, Paul Buselink, who was a USDA legume breeder here in Columbia, an adjunct professor at Mizzou, went down to the University of Arkansas and met with Sam Offutt, got his germplasm, brought it up to Missouri, increased the seed, and released it. And it was by far the best and the most widely grown Lespedeza in our state for some time. We'll talk about why. It's almost impossible to find Marion right now because it was brown bagged by our growers. And so it killed the market, unfortunately. My screen is okay. There are two types of Lespedeza, and we've mentioned them earlier. There's the Kobe type. Now, when people talk about common Lespedeza, common is an ambiguous term. When somebody says this is common brome grass, what they mean is it's not a specific variety, not a specific cultivar. But in Lespedeza, in annual Lespedeza, common really means Kobe. It's just growing all over the place. It's like when people say Kentucky 31 fescue, that's just common tall fescue, Kentucky 31 really. And so the Kobe types, there's some advantages and disadvantages. First of all, they're disease resistant. And that's why in a field, if we have volunteer Lespedeza and we didn't plant it and we've owned the farm for 15 or 20 years, that's going to be a Kobe type because the Korean types will disappear. So it's disease resistant. The reason that we don't have as much Kobe as we do Korean in the short term is because it's late flowering. And when an annual is late flowering, it doesn't set seed sometimes before the frost. And so the only plants we have coming back are from seed in the seed bank, or from hard seed that just germinated the following year. Cobe types, Marion Lespedeza was a Cobe type Lespedeza, and it was selected for early flowering. So it had all of the great traits, including high seed yield. Now, we don't normally worry about early and late flowering in terms of persistence because we're usually dealing with perennials, but it's very important with annuals to recognize which ones flower early and drop seed. The other type of Lespedeza that we have in our state is Korean. Very high yielding, productive, high quality, but it's susceptible to tar spot and bacteria wilt. It's early flowering, so it drops a lot of seed. You can tell the difference. It's hard to see on this slide. I blew it up quite a bit, but you can tell the difference between Kobe and common sometimes by looking at the shape of the leaf, but the easiest way is to look at the stem and get a magnifying glass. And if there are hairs, this pubescence as it's called, if there are hairs that point down toward the crown, then it's a striate or it's a Kobe type, it's common. If the hairs on the stem point up, it's stipulaceae or it's a Korean type. This is a field of Ryan. Ryan's not on the call today, standing in a field of Marion Lespedeza, Kobe type. We have a new variety. It's actually been around for about 10 or 15 years, Legend Lespedeza, that has been marketed heavily in Southwest Missouri. And so that we'll talk about Legend in a little while. Not a lot of research on Legend, but it appears to be a good variety. The question comes up, why do people grow annual Lespedeza? And there are quite a few reasons, but the first one, and what we'll do is we'll just list these out, then we'll walk through them with some data and some figures. But the first one is it fills a summer gap. It grows extremely well in July and August, and that's usually when we lack forages. It competes at a pH 5 to 5.5. Of course, it will grow at pH 6, pH 6.2, 6.3, it will grow well. But what happens at this low pH is those other plants don't grow as well. Lespedeza sort of picks up speed, you might say, and we'll see some photos where it has completely taken over a field. This is something for the turf. This is a fun fact, but for turf people, when we have Lespedeza in our lawns, in our yards, usually that means we need the lime. It's a high quality forage. It fixes nitrogen. No one really knows how much nitrogen, but probably 50 pounds to the acre in a pure stand. It contains tannins, and tannins are important for bypass protein and absorption of amino acids in the lower tract, as well as activity against parasites. Not high tannin, just moderate to low levels of tannins. It's non-bloating. It gives us excellent animal performance. And before World War II, but after World War II, by the way, there was a lot of synthetic nitrogen. The Germans had developed this technique because of munitions. And but before World War II, there wasn't as much commercial nitrogen applied to the fields, and so people relied on legumes to provide the nitrogen to their pastures. And it was commonplace to run the cattle through a stand of Lespedeza when the seed heads were present, and that there was something in the Lespedeza that caused white fat instead of yellow fat in the animals. And I've never seen the research on that, but it's It's common knowledge. I'll have to dig up the literature on that, but it's one of the legumes that gives us white fat. Let's talk about these one at a time. The yield curve. We know that tall fescue has this bimodal curve. It starts increasing here in late March, April, and it would peak sometime around June and drop off and get the summer lulled, and we get another 1/3 of our tall fescue growth here in the fall. And Lespedeza fills that gap. Here is a stand of fescue Lespedeza near Tuscumbia. This is Jesse Dowdy's farm. Jesse passed away about 10 years ago. But before this was cut, he hayed this field in June. And before it was cut, you would swear that it's a stand of 100% tall fescue. There's no legume in it. And you have to get right down on top of the grass and point the camera straight down to see under the canopy is annual Lespedeza. And if we come back to that field in, let's say, August 14, it may look like that. And so when we talk about annual Lespedeza in tall fescue, we may call that a grass legume mix. But because the growth curves do not overlap very much, we really consider this more of a double crop. We have fescue, and if we had red and white clover in the fescue, we'd have a nice mix. But the germination would occur, the Lespedeza germination would occur sometime around early May, and that plant would sit there, sometimes in April. That plant would sit there. It has shade tolerance. And as soon as the grass canopy is removed, assuming that it's warm conditions, we'll see Lespedeza take over. Here are some of the data that compare. This MU3993 is a selection out of Marion. It's an experimental line. And compare that to Korean Lespedeza and Legend Lespedeza. And this would be the yield at 2 locations in 2 years. So this would be up at Linnaeus in 2014, Mount Vernon 2014, then come back and run the experiment again in 2015 at Linnaeus and at Mount Vernon Southwest Center. And what we can see here is, yes, this first year, Legend Lespedeza was equal to or higher than Marion Lespedeza, at least a derivative of Marion and Korean. But that was at FSRC. If we go down to Mount Vernon, the opposite is true. The Korean Lespedeza is higher yielding. Go into the next year, and we see that Kobe and Korean Lespedeza were both higher than Legend Lespedeza. And come back in Southwest Center 2015, and the same thing. So the reason for saying that is Legend Lespedeza is sometimes higher yielding, but 3 out of 4 cases here, it's equal to or significantly lower than Korean and common Korean or Kobe Lespedezas. The reason for saying all this is because of the popular press advertisements out there. There was a photo circulated on the promotional literature, and it compared Legend to Marion, and I've never seen that. We had quite a bit of Marion, and there were some even in the greenhouse, and these fields that had Legend and Marion, we never saw that. That may occur, but it would be rare. These 3 Lespedezas were also compared for their nutritive value, NDF, digestible NDF, and then ADF, which estimates digestible energy, crude protein, true digestibility. And basically, we might see some differences. For example, Legend was lower here in its digestible fiber, and even though we could say that's not good, it's really not that much. They're pretty much the same in terms of fiber, protein, and digestibility. If we look at polyphenols, the only one we're really going to look at here is the condensed tannins here. Condensed tannins are important for bypass protein and activity against parasites. And you can see here that legend has a higher level. It's statistically significant. I don't know how important it is really biologically, but it's there. Also about, so that takes care of, that takes care of the Kobe types and Korean types. And the bottom line on here is that it's good quality forage. This is a study from Kansas State. This was conducted in eastern Kansas with steers grazing fescue Lespedeza. And you can see they had Korean Lespedeza. Basically, in a fescue Lespedeza stand, it's a 200-day grazing, and at the end of the year, if we average the daily gain, they got about 1.3. It's slightly higher than red clover, and the red clover will disappear, and less than white clover. 1.3 is typical. As a rule of thumb, what we've said, if we're grazing, if our steers are grazing infected tall fescue, they'll gain about 1 pound a day, give or take, and that varies from year to year. So this makes sense. We add annual Lespedeza, it goes from 1 pound or 1.1 up to 1.3. It's an increment, as we say. This is an increment of improvement. The important thing here also is this is provided when red and white clover are dormant. Now this year was an unusual year for white clover, and I think we know that. But most of the time, when we see Lespedeza growing in July and August, we don't see a lot of red and white clover. So it's providing that gain at the time that there's a lack of forage in the pasture. Managing annual Lespedeza, let's just say that we already have a stand. What are we talking about? Are we talking about plant persistence or stand persistence? In the case of alfalfa, if we want to keep our alfalfa, we have to keep the individual plants. There's no reseeding. I mean, we have some bees and they'll pollinate, but the seed quality is such here in Missouri that we're not really going to have volunteer alfalfa from seed drop. So when we keep alfalfa, we keep the individual plants. In fact, if that plant stand gets down to less than a certain number, 3 or 4 per square foot, stems per square foot, we'll consider thickening the stand with orchard grass or replanting, but we need to keep the individual plants. In the case of something like a legume like bird's foot trefoil, we can keep some of the plants. Most of the plants die after 2 years or 3 years at most because of root and crown rot. And so we consider bird's foot trefoil a short-lived perennial. Alfalfa is a long-lived perennial, but in our conditions, bird's foot trefoil is short-lived. So the reason we keep bird's foot trefoil is because it drops a lot of seed, plus the plants can live 2 years and sometimes 3. So when we're managing annual Lespedeza, it doesn't make any sense to talk about plant persistence. It's an annual. So we have to keep the stand by natural reseeding. So a lot of the management protects the reproductive development. Let's talk about management here in terms of forage yield. This is a stand of Marion Lespedeza, which is a Kobe type, and Summit, which is a Korean type. Both of these are from Sam Offutt, by the way. And so the plants were, they germinated well before June, I'm sure, but they started expressing here in July, came up, and clipping. These were clipped instead of grazed, but they were clipped right here in the first week of August. And we can see what happened. We'll look at Summit first. In other words, this is Korean Lespedeza. If we clip at 12 centimeters, let's just call this a 5-inch stubble, we have pretty good yield all the way through October. But if we clip down to 2 inches, 2.5 inches, we have a significant drop in yield. And so think of grazing pressure. When we manage annual Lespedeza, it's not good to graze it down as low as we do sometimes. The same thing is true for Marion Lespedeza. If we graze or clip and leave a 5-inch stubble, have quite a bit of yield. But if we pressure that plant, that stand, and and leave only a 2.5-inch stubble, we'll see a significant drop in yield. So managing for yield and productivity is related to stubble height. We have to graze at a moderate height. 5 inches is ideal. And here is something important. Same study. This is Dave Davis's PhD dissertation. Dave's not on the call today, but this is what he did back in the 90s. And you can see here that if you leave it alone, Marion was a fantastic reseeder. Now, normally we would say that a Korean Lespedeza will outproduce a Cobe-type Lespedeza in terms of seed production. But remember what we said earlier. Marion is a Cobe-type Lespedeza selected for high seed yield, which is important in persistence of an annual that has to reseed every fall. And you can see this huge difference. The reason is because Marion produces flowers up and down the stem, and Summit or Korean Lespedeza produces flowers only at the top of the plant. So they do pretty well here, pretty good seed production here. But on these down here, if we push those plants and they're grazed down to 2.5 inches, especially this time of year when they are flowering and trying to, those seed are trying to mature, it's very unwise to graze down to 2.5 inches on a Korean type. You can probably get away with it with Marion. Since we're here, we'll go ahead and talk about establishing annual Lespedeza. And by the way, I forgot to say this. The rule of thumb is if we're grazing, we graze lightly starting September 1. That's really the critical time for the seed development. Seed will flower right about now, but we need to be careful not to graze low, particularly September 1 through October 10. That's mid-Missouri. What we say is 40 days and 40 nights. Just be careful September and early October, or we won't have seed for the next year. People will be establishing annual Lespedeza this winter. Heather Nichols called around to 5 different major seed dealers in Missouri and collected this information. She asked what seed are available. In all cases, they said Korean. The reason that that's in quotes instead of just formatted like a typical variety name, it's in quotes, is probably not Korean. It says on the bag Korean Lespedeza VNS, which means variety not stated. It's probably just a mix of Korean and Kobe Lespedeza with the variety not stated. All of them had that she called. She also asked, is the seed dehulled? And most of them said no. One of them said maybe. Dehulling will remove only about 10% of the weight. It's a very light, chaffy seed coat. So it can affect the seeding rate, but not by much. The prices differed considerably. So if you're wanting to plant Lespedeza, it doesn't hurt to check around. Prices were based on a 50-pound bag, and they went as low as $1.12 up to $2.20. At least those are the numbers quoted on the phone. If we're going to plant Lespedeza, annual Lespedeza, the recommended rate is 20 pounds of pure live seed per acre. That also is in quotes because nobody does it. I wouldn't do it. The best way to probably get a good stand of annual Lespedeza is plant about 6 or 7 pounds and make sure that it reseeds that first year instead of planting 20 pounds and not being careful. If we're careful with reseeding, we could easily see anywhere from 30 to 50 pounds pure live seed drop just from that first stand. And so we'll get all the Lespedeza we want just by being patient. It can be broadcast typically late January when the ground is frozen. We're not so worried about Lespedeza breaking dormancy when we have a warm spell in the winter, breaking dormancy and then dying because of a late freeze. We don't worry about that. It usually germinates in late April or early May. This is a good time to say Lespedeza is a C3 plant if you're a physiologist and are curious about that. But for some reason, it has this growth curve in the summer as if it were a C4. So we're not worried. Broadcast in late January, it will work its way down into the soil with the freezing and thawing of the soil. It can be hoofed in as well. The only important thing is, you might suspect, is making sure that the seed does in fact go to the soil. We've seen cases where people broadcast in the winter, frost seeding, and they don't have a stand, and you come back and look at the field and there's so much thatch that the seed never touched the soil. So if you're grazing it, you can hoof it in that way. You can broadcast the seed and harrow it in in the spring. Here we're talking about something like early April, late March, or you can drill same time, March or April. Conclusions here about annual Lespedeza. It is one of the better legumes for filling the summer gap as far as stand persistence. We call it the poor man's alfalfa because it can grow on a pH 5 soil and provides forage in that summer gap. Competes on the low pH soil, produces excellent steer gains as well as red clover. Moderate level of tannins, not high levels. You know, if we have too high level, we'll have a problem with preference, palatability. It is non-bloating. It can be established in the winter, frost seeding, or the spring. The most common frost seeding recommendation for pastures in Missouri is 5 or 6 pounds of red clover, a half to a pound of white clover, and 6 to 7 pounds of annual Lespedeza. That's a very common recommendation. This is critical. It must reseed to persist. That's why we decided to talk about it here in late August. It has to reseed if we want it for the next year. And it is affected by grazing pressure.